So morning everyone, thank you for coming. This kind of nicely fits in with the previous presentation, probably intentionally, so thanks for that. It's about, because we're talking about climate-based innovation, so kind of mixing a bit out the sustainability topic. So what we're looking at in this work is integrating between some ideas around innovation and value chains, particularly looking at the Kenyan horticultural sector. This paper is written by myself and R.T. Krishnan from the University of Manchester. And just to give you a background on how this came about, my background is I've done some research on inclusive innovation, particularly in the ICT sector. R.T. is a development economist, and she's working on kind of upgrading and climate-based standards and this type of area. And so we started talking about how we might combine our two pieces of work. We saw some parallels. And actually, hearing about this workshop actually pushed us to do it. So thanks to the organisers, and so there is an good output for us. So first of all, just to introduce some of the links here between climate change and innovation. Particularly looking at kind of agricultural value chains and small-scale farmers. So small-scale, how are small-scale farmers and in agriculture, in value chains, affected by climate change? I think we can see it in two ways, really. First of all, if you think about value chains, there's this growing demand for sustainable practices in value chains. So firms in value chains, particularly lead firms, want higher quality products. They want them to be more sustainable, and this particularly relates to standards. You think of the growing number of standards which consumers are interested in, and also, like governments and private standards, which are kind of orientating the chain. So these are very important, and this is kind of pushing small-scale farmers to kind of improve their sustainability practices. And on the other hand, of course, also these small-scale farmers in many places are actually being affected by the weather extremes. So this is just a couple of examples I've taken recently in kind of East Africa. There's multiple droughts that have happened over the previous few years, and there have been some kind of talk about how that connects into the wider climate change issues. But in the other places, there's flooding, and also things like the more prevalent pests and diseases which come from these changes in climate. So it's not just about these standards that come from the value chain, but also how these direct effects come from weather extremes. So this is kind of the links of climate change. And one of the things that the literature has talked about is the possibility that climate-based innovation, so innovations, can help to, if you like, somehow reduce or improve farmers, either reduce their risk or improve their situations so that they're not so affected by climate change. So, we might imagine some different innovations around that. So this is kind of where innovation comes into this story. So just pulling out some of the literature on the climate-based innovation, we really came across, if you like, two kind of main strands, which actually in a way are quite different, and they talk in many ways about quite different things. So first of all, we have this global value chain literature. So this is talking about small-scale producers still, but how they link into these international markets, how they can be part of these large-scale markets. And this really focused particularly from this small-scale farmer side and on the ideas of standards and quality. So farmers really need to achieve certain standards, be part of certain quality regimes to make sure that they can be part of these global markets and to get, the value add to their products and to get better prices. And where does innovation fit into this in this literature? Well, it talks very much about, I think, about how lead firms are really driving these innovations, particularly through these standards. So, from things like the Rainforest Alliance, these types of standards, how these are basically a way of kind of lead firms pushing certain innovations. And it's often about informal innovations, kind of upgrading style innovations where I talk about. So a few examples of this, I'm sorry the pictures are not particularly good, but the top one might be, for example, some kinds of science and technology developed pest-resistant seeds, certain kind of pesticides which can help improve small-scale farmers' situation. And also things like mechanization, which the bottom picture is supposed to be, certain mechanization which can improve the quality of planting, improve these types of things. So this is the type of innovations that are talked about in this literature. On the other hand, we have this inclusive innovation or frugal innovation discussion, and this is very different when it talks about climate-based innovation, it talks very much about these small-scale adaptations based upon local knowledge and farmer networks, which we've already discussed a little bit. And so I kind of use frugal innovation in a slightly different way to what others have. So I'm just going to quickly define it. So I'm really just talking here in terms of low cost and low complexity innovations. My definition is quite simple. I know it's still not clear on what exactly frugal innovation people use in different ways. So I'm just using it in a very quite simple way, just a low cost, low complexity innovation. So inclusive innovation often talks about these multiple cumulative, if you like, small scale or frugal innovations. And so an example of this, and this is the image, again it's not that great here, but it's actually supposed to be a picture of intercropping among some small scale farmers. And that's an example of a kind of a small scale innovation that might kind of take place but can kind of improve farmers' conditions against things like pests and diseases and kind of wind and other kind of extremes. And as you can see, there's, in a way, the farmers who are in both of these literatures are kind of broadly quite similar. But on the other hand, they have really, really different ideas of what innovation is, what the farms are doing, who's leading these activities. So this kind of was the starting point of our work. How do we understand this kind of seeming gap, or this conundrum? And so this comes to the kind of research question we're answering in the paper, which is, how does the frugality of innovation vary with farmers participating in these global or local value chains? And this obviously relates back, so hopefully we can use this question to kind of explore this literature and try to kind of integrate between these quite separate different literatures. So now going on to the methodology, well, we wanted to actually use a quantitative approach to this, and having the data available that we did. And so this is based upon a survey done basically by Arti in Kenyan horticulture, or particularly focusing on mango and avocado wheat farmers. So she did a really great job at the end of last year and the start of this year. She interviewed several hundred farmers in 3 different districts. She kind of traipsed around all these very remote fields and ate hundreds of mangoes. She doesn't eat them anymore after this. So, and she produced quite a good sample survey, and the details of some of the methodologies are in the paper. But just to kind of roughly outline them, I mean, this was a survey research on farmer practices. So she talked, it was a wider set of questions on different practices, but some of them particularly related to these kind of small-scale adaptations which would fit into this question that we're asking. We're using for this particular study 300 farmers in 3 regions, and it's quite convenient that actually 50-50 between ones that produce, roughly around 50-50, that produce into the global value chains and the local value chains. This was actually fully sampled in row, but so there's just also some kind of just summary details. And so then the point is, how do we measure these frugal innovations? This is something that a lot of the literatures talk about when we talk about frugal as these small-scale adaptive activities, and people like Zanello and even the World Bank have talked about this being quite difficult to measure. The ways that we've measured innovation in the past is very different to some of these very small-scale activities, which still can be significant in kind of cumulative effects. And so how have we done it in our work? This is a bit of a complicated diagram, but I'm going to just try and kind of quickly summarize it. What we did was there's certain questions in the survey about farmers answering, do they do a certain practice or a certain small-scale innovation or larger-scale innovation or not? When that happened, we gave each farmer a score. We also weighted that score by how we thought how costly and complex that innovation was. So trying to weight it by kind of the frugality of innovation. Then over the whole survey, we ended up with this thing at the bottom there. This thing at the bottom here, which is a score-based scale. So the farmers ended up with scores. We then split that into quartiles, so we had 4 different quartiles of farmers. High frugality or low frugality. So this is the idea of this, that we could bring all these innovations together and build this kind of score of innovations. Now we did this across a number of different innovation types, so the questions related to a number of different innovation types, for example, climate extreme, water use, waste management. And each of these different innovation types can also be kind of, if you like, put under the umbrella of more related to climate adaptation, so this is when the climate's extreme, what they do, and also sustainable production, so this is more like the ongoing activities that might relate to. And then we also added those up to a total score of innovation. So it's a bit of a complex approach, but I think in this approach it's kind of an interesting way of linking more large-scale innovation activities amongst the farming and these more kind of small-scale ones, and I'll talk about that a bit later. So I don't know how many economists are in the room. I'm not an economist, so hopefully no one's going to ask me any hard question. I'm going to quickly go through a few of the...
many.
Oh, really? Oh, no.
Many.
Please don't be aware. So, yeah, I'm just going to quickly go through a few of the results very briefly. So, yeah, what this shows then is the two different types. So, on your left is the global value chain farmers. Oh. On the left is the global value chain farmers, on the right is the local value chain farmers. And this shows where they score on the scale for the different types of innovation overall, then those two innovation genres and the different innovation types. I think the line I really want to look at is that top one, the general trends. And this is kind of what you might expect. You know, global value chain farmers in the global value chains are more likely to be involved in more costly and complex innovations, whilst those in local value chains are more likely to be involved in kind of less costly or small-scale adaptations. But what's kind of interesting is there are some, and you know that probably might fit in with how we might imagine it to be, but there are some kind of interesting trends here. First of all, there's actually in some of the areas, there's actually quite a number of frugal or low kind of like farmers in the global value chain, but undertaking kind of low-cost or small-scale innovations. And similarly, it's not a majority by any means, but still, you know, up to 29% of farmers in the local value chains who are actually involved in quite innovative or a number of practices. And I think this is quite interesting for policy if you think about it. Think about how we talk about frugal innovation of these small farmers who are kind of quite local, looking at local markets. Well, actually, what our evidence suggests is actually even farmers who are, you know, more dynamic in global value chains are also undertaking these small-scale kind of adaptations, and that's important. And the second point there also is the idea that some farmers are involved in like more these local value chain farmers are involved in more dynamic activities. So, you know, we could think of these as possibly kind of champion local value chain farmers who might help in policy implementation. So this graph then shows that score, the overall innovation score. This is showing the different kind of determinants through a regression and exploring which of those are significant and which are not. I'm just going to quickly summarize this, but I think what we see is a number of expected trends. So the complexity of the innovation, more complexity and more costly innovation, particularly linked to things like the skills and capacity of farmers, the kind of education, more like the learning they're given. Also, location is quite important, and also ownership of land. So, if you're an owner, if you have your own land, you're more likely to be kind of investing in more costly and more complex innovations than if not. And I think these kind of trends are kind of expected. If we look at the literature, this is the types of things we often see. There are a few unexpected trends. In fact, one of the things when me and Nancy started doing this is we were quite interested to see, we thought that young farmers might be someone who drove innovation a lot. But actually when we look through the data, it doesn't seem that way. There doesn't seem to be that much significant. And there's also this thing about alternative activities that is kind of a bit odd. So farmers involved in alternative activities tend to be involved in more costly innovation. We kind of speculate a little bit on what the reasons might be in the paper, but I think there probably needs to be a bit more research to understand those. So, you know, going back to that past slide, so this is kind of innovation in general, and now the next slide goes back to those different genres and types of innovation and explore the determinants of that. And if in the last slide, this kind of fitted a little bit with, if you like, with what we'd expect, when we dig down a bit, we see some differences between different types of innovation. So it's not so similar, if you like. So, for example, we see certain types of innovation, particularly around things like land use and waste management, where moving from local value chains to global value chains makes a big difference. So we think this is probably related to standards. So these ones are particularly important for standards. Others where the capacity is important. So So groups who are undertaking activities which they've been taught or explicitly taught are much more likely to be involved in costly and complex innovation. And then also this idea of the innovation genres. So the innovation genres is difference between kind of more sustainable production and climate adaptation is quite different. So these two genres, if you look across the kind of different determinants, are quite different. Sustainable production is often related to, looks more like coming from value chain activities, explicit learning, whereas the climate adaptation, the determinants seem to be still related a little bit to that, but more, it seems that more the innovation is kind of more broad-based, so more local value chain farmers involved in it. So I'm just going to quickly go through this good time. So that also has some interesting policy implications, we think, around, you know, innovation is not just a monolith. There's these different types of innovation related to what the activity is, even within this single area of climate-based innovation. And it also kind of questions how climate-based innovation might be guided. There are obviously some areas where private sector is important, but other areas where it seems like this more broad-based kind of networks can be important. I don't think I've got much time for this, so I'm just going to go through, but we did do some other kind of work looking at the different modes of learning in more detail, and also looking at the feedback effects. So we talked about here the kind of link between different determinants and that innovation score. Here we're looking at all those determinants and looking at the effects of how they affect whether a farmer is in the local value chain or the global value chain. So actually we find there's feedback effects. And I think that's also quite interesting to policy because, you know, we might think of these two things together. So just going into the last 2 or 3 minutes, just to conclude then. So what we've tried to do in this work is to link between innovation and value chains. And we thought that the methodology was quite an interesting thing. The way, perhaps in general, if we look at innovation in general, it can sometimes not show us anything. But by splitting this innovation into these different innovation types and genres, it's kind of provided a bit more granular understanding and some of the differences. And also this use of this score-based scale allowed us to explore these different types of very small-scale innovation and more complex innovation in a kind of a single framework. So we think this is quite interesting, and we think that it might be an approach which can also be used more widely to explore frugal innovation in other sectors. For example, if you think of something like the informal sector or small-scale manufacturing versus large-scale, these types of models might be used. And then more generally, I think the more general conclusions, first of all, in terms of frugality, and this is in terms of small-scale innovation, it's not just about these lower-value, local value chain farmers. Everyone's doing it. It's a crucial element of global value chain farmers and their climate adaptation activities. And local value chain farmers and climate innovation, yes, local farmers are sometimes more innovative than perhaps we might think. And innovation types are also not the same. So we talked about these different genres and how that should affect how they treat it. So I think that if you think of some of these results, they can be also quite important in terms of policy. So I think I've gone over my time, so I think I should stop there. So thanks very much. And this is a bit of a work in progress, so I'm happy to hear any feedback and comments.
Okay, thanks very much. Question? Yeah. Okay. Let's start.
Thank you so much for the presentation. You were referring to the findings so that you could, as a government, decide they use those sort of farmers as champions and so forth. But for me, still not clear. Let's say I want actually to improve the resilience of those communities. What if your innovation score one another way? What idea delivers the best effect? So would we want people to have those frugal innovations or the other, some kind of cost effectiveness? What's best? I would like to know more your opinion.
Okay, I will collect a few. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So, who do you think should drive the frugal innovation in these value chains? Or who is the driver in these value chains?
Yeah, and these might well be two very different questions. least the answers may be very different. Yeah.
So I assume all the farmers were growing the same crop. One question is, it looked like for the statistical significance of water usage, the ones that were the most significant were the two cities. So was there any particular legislation or anything particular to those two cities which you've analyzed that could lead to those results?
Very good. One more, perhaps, at this first round? No, this is the first round.
Okay. In terms of the first question, I don't think we can. I'm not that keen to particularly give which has more value, the small scale or the large scale innovations. Because I think this work actually suggests that they both have a purpose, but maybe different innovation types lend themselves better to kind of these small scale incremental changes, and others maybe lend themselves better to the large scale changes, for example, driven by value chain standards. So I don't think that there should be an objective kind of this is better than the other. I think it's more kind of looking at kind of how each of those activities or fits within how innovations might work. So yeah, and obviously, I mean, small scale innovation can be very small, but over time, and I think this is what a lot of the inclusive innovation literature is talking about, the importance of how incremental changes can be quite significant over the long term. So I think this is the kind of, in a way, the goal of this work is to try and combine those small scale, I mean, acknowledging that the small scale innovations are different to the larger innovations, but trying to fit them into one framework rather than kind of dealing with them in a very separate way, because as this kind of results seem to show that, you know, all farmers in this particular case are undertaking these small scale as well as some of the large scale innovations. Who should drive frugal innovations in value chains? And maybe this is virtually the same answer as the previous one. I don't think there's a particular. I don't think we can particularly. What the evidence, this evidence shows us, is perhaps that that there isn't just one driver. And I think that's one of the points I made about the policy implications. That this is probably showing a kind of there's different actors who are involved in different elements. So, like I said, some of the elements around standards, yeah, they can definitely be driven by private firms. But then more this kind of stuff about the climate change extremes and how farmers are innovating, that doesn't seem to, and this was one of the interesting results, that didn't seem to come at all from some of the things you'd expect, you know, like the determinants around the global value chain, the determinants around kind of explicit learning. Rather it seemed from what we could see in the evidence, that it came from more from kind of farmer networks and, you know, some resources and farmer groups and things like that. So those two different types of innovation, it had quite different, if you like, drivers. And so I think that the policy would be that there'd probably be some elements which the state can support and push a bit more in terms of, for example, through kind of you know, outreach and farmer policy, and others they might kind of work more with the private sector. It's not they're not all the same crop. We did two crops, which are avocado and mango. They're actually quite similar in many ways, and a lot of the farmers grow both. So they are particularly selected as certain horticultural activities which kind of similar we could explore. I could pass this question around the different cities onto Artie, because she's the one who really kind of got into the field work on this. I would possibly suspect that it's probably something to do with kind of land distribution and land use and these types of things. And maybe, I mean, some regions obviously also maybe slightly more affluent than others. But maybe I can get back to you on that question.
Yeah, if I may just one follow-up on that. Then if it's different crops, did you look at the average water that should be used for this type of crop and control for that in your model? Or is this just a total water usage limit? And also, did you control for rainfall in the region?
Yeah, no, that could be another effect. I don't think we did control for that. I mean, I think generally, as I say, like avocado and mango are fairly similar, I think, in terms of these types of water use. But yeah, I think the rainfall is probably more important, and that's probably something that we might consider. I think actually some of the models that Artie is doing now, she's just trying to gather various kind of rainfall statistics together for some of her work to try and allow for that. Yeah, so that's maybe something we could actually bring into some of these regressions in the future.
Okay, good. Kate, you wanted to just ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
thanks for some thought-provoking ideas. I'm wondering, you said there are multiple drivers in these things, but there are also multiple agendas. And I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on what kind of agenda you see this kind of research as serving. In your work with Richard Heeks on M-Pesa, you were looking at the ways in which engagement with middle of the pyramid, so middle class operators, could be used to develop more frugal innovations in order to contribute to poverty alleviation and move innovations into low-income areas. But now you seem to be looking at these things in a way that travels back up the chain, looking at frugal innovations in local value chains and the ways in which those may travel between global and local value chains. So I'm wondering if you've thought about the potential uses of this, and are you looking at the opposite direction, the ways in which frugal innovations can travel up the chain or down the chain?
Okay. One question perhaps to go with that. No, then you have a bit more space to try and answer this complicated question.
Where do I start? Okay, so yeah, I think the probably a general answer to that question would be maybe we haven't got that far yet. I think that this was a first stage piece of research where I think one of our interests was to try and quantify some of these ideas. That was probably, and from Artie's perspective, to try and bring in some of the climate change ideas. So I think we were probably kind of stumbling at the first step of what types of methodology do we use, how do we bring this together, and then kind of pulling in these different questions from the survey, and then looking to see if it actually was logical and made sense, which it kind of did as I've outlined. But that doesn't mean we haven't thought about some of these things. So I think, for example, one of the policy implications I talked about was how, in that work, was about how kind of local value chain farms, actually some of them seem to be a lot more innovative than might be kind of considered within kind of the literatures, and talk about the policy potentially of champion farmers or things like that. And I think that maybe does link a little bit into some of the past work I've done in the ICT sector, which is similar things where you see it's not the kind of very lowest level kind of actors who are involved in innovation who are really driving the kind of changes, but like the middle level actors. So maybe that links in terms of them. I'm not sure, upstream and downstream activity. I mean, there's definitely some of those different the genres or the different types of innovation. Some of them are definitely, you can see from the determinants that are very much driven by those standards and the kind of downstreaming of standards, which then drives kind of innovation activities. But then others, particularly around these kind of more climate extremes, don't see. I mean, there doesn't seem to be in that work. There didn't seem to be such a trend. So in certain kind of questions we asked, it was kind of not that much different between global value chain farmers and local value chain farmers. The different adaptations and changes they made. So I thought that was quite interesting. And so there seemed to be certain activities which were more like this flow between farms, even if they were involved in the value chain. So that might be a way of thinking about what types of activities might move up the chain. Because obviously, if I'm a lead firm, and I want my small-scale farmers to kind of be as environmental and clear as possible, there may be certain activities where I can support those local innovation networks that we've been talking about earlier. Maybe that's a policy which can actually directly help me as a tea producer or an avocado producer to be more sustainable. So I think maybe in a way we could perhaps make a business case to some avocado producers or something that they should support the honeybee network and these types of things because it could help them with climate change. So, but I think it's the very early stages. It's different. I think actually that probably needs more qualitative.
Yeah. Well, it comes back to your bigger question, but you will come back to that in your general commentary, I'm sure. Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks very much, Chris. Saskia is next. You have a presentation up there somewhere. You want a 5-minute warning? Yeah. Okay. All right, I'll give you a 5-minute break. Please go.
Yes.